The rhythmic hum of the attic fan suddenly felt deafening against the tight, shallow pull of my lungs. I sat on the exposed fiberglass insulation, the rough wooden floorboards biting into my knees, staring at the rusted metal lockbox resting in my lap. A prickling numbness started at my wrists and crawled upward, leaving my fingers clumsy and slow as I turned over the glossy photograph. It was my husband, Richard. The silver in his hair caught the sunlight, his smile wide and relaxed, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in over a decade. He was standing with his arms slung over the shoulder of a younger man, perhaps early 40s. They were standing on the porch of a house I had never seen. Beneath the photograph sat a stack of carbon copy bank ledgers bound tightly with a brittle rubber band. I didn't need my reading glasses to understand the rows of numbers. Regular withdrawals, $2,000 every single month, dating back 30 years. Maggie? Richard's voice drifted up through the ceiling vents from the kitchen below. It sounded so painfully normal. So casual. Maggie, did you see where I put the packing tape? I looked at the ledger. I looked at the photograph. 38 years of marriage. 38 years of shared coffee pots, folded laundry, compromised vacations, and quiet evenings. And right beneath the floorboards of our shared life, a parallel universe had been quietly thriving. To understand how you can share a bed with a man for nearly 4 decades and never truly know him, you have to go back 2 weeks. To the day the moving boxes arrived. We were downsizing. The house we had raised our 2 daughters in, the sprawling colonial with the wraparound porch, had become too large, too quiet, and too full of echoes since Richard's retirement. I was standing in the kitchen, aggressively wrapping a porcelain gravy boat in newspaper, when Richard walked in with another stack of flat cardboard boxes. I still think we should have hired professionals, Richard, I said, snapping off a piece of tape. We've accumulated 38 years of history. Let someone else deal with the dust. Richard set the boxes down, his jaw setting into that familiar, stubborn line. I don't want strangers pawing through our private lives, Maggie. We can handle it. We just have to be systematic. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. I'll take the study today, and I'll handle the attic tomorrow. The attic? I paused, looking up at him. You haven't been up there in years. Your knees won't tolerate the crouching. Let me do it. No. The word came out sharper than intended. He cleared his throat, softening his tone, though his eyes remained fixed on the floor. No, I said I'll do it. There's just heavy boxes of old tax files. It's dirty work. Focus on the kitchen, all right? I didn't argue. In long marriages, you learn which hills are worth dying on, and the attic didn't seem like one of them. But looking back, the signs of his panic were already there, subtle but present. 2 nights later, the mystery deepened. I had come downstairs for a glass of water at 2 a.m. The house was pitch black, save for a sliver of light spilling from beneath the study door. As I approached, I heard Richard's voice. It was low, hushed, and strained with an anxiety I wasn't accustomed to hearing from my calm, pragmatic husband. I thought we agreed, Richard was saying into the phone. A pause. You know I can't do that right now. The house is in chaos. She's here all day. Another agonizingly long pause. Just wait. Give me a week. I'll make the transfer on the 1st, like always. I stood frozen in the hallway, the hardwood cold against my bare feet. Make the transfer? I backed away slowly, retreating to our bedroom, the rhythm of my own breathing sounding loud in my ears. The next morning over breakfast, I watched him. I watched the way he poured his coffee, the way he folded the newspaper. He looked exactly like the man I married. But the air between us suddenly felt thick with unspoken words. Who were you talking to last night? I asked, keeping my voice utterly devoid of accusation. I focused on buttering my toast. I heard the slight clinking of his spoon against his ceramic mug stop. Last night? He asked, his voice a practiced level of casual. Just a wrong number, Maggie. Some telemarketer operating in a different time zone. Why? Did I wake you? No, I lied smoothly. Just heard murmuring. He didn't bring up the attic again that week. He seemed to be deliberately avoiding it, finding endless chores in the garage and the yard. The tension in his shoulders grew tighter with each passing day. Yesterday morning, he finally left the house. Hardware store, he announced, jingling his keys. Need more heavy-duty tape and some spackle for the hallway. I'll be gone a couple of hours. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, the quiet of the house pressed in on me. I looked up at the ceiling. The pull-down string for the attic stairs hung perfectly still in the hallway. I didn't make a conscious decision. My feet simply carried me there. I pulled the wooden stairs down, the springs protesting with a loud screech. The air up there was stifling, smelling of dry rot and forgotten winters. I navigated through stacks of old Christmas decorations and our daughters' elementary school art projects. I don't know what drew my eye to it. Perhaps it was the way the dust was disturbed, brushed away from one specific floorboard in the far corner, tucked behind an old cedar chest. I knelt down, the knees of my jeans soaking up the grime. I pressed my weight against the edge of the board. It tilted. Beneath it lay a hollow cavity between the joists. And sitting inside, covered in a fine layer of gray dust, was a heavy, industrial-grade lockbox. It was locked, of course. A small, circular keyhole mocked me. I sat back on my heels, the stifling heat of the attic pressing sweat against my neck. I could have waited. I could have confronted him when he returned, but the memory of his hushed phone call echoed in the dim space. I went down to his workbench in the garage and retrieved a heavy flathead screwdriver and a hammer. When I returned to the attic, I didn't hesitate. I wedged the metal tip beneath the lock mechanism and brought the hammer down. Once. Twice. The metal groaned. On the third strike, the clasp snapped with a sharp, violent crack that made my ears ring. I threw the lid back. And that brings us back to this moment. The photograph. The ledgers. 30 years of a hidden life. I stared at the name printed on the deposit slips. David Hayes. An address in a small town 2 states over was printed meticulously next to the name. I traced the letters with a trembling finger. All these years, when he claimed he was traveling for regional sales conferences, when he said the company bonuses were lean, when he stared out the window with that distant, melancholy look I thought was just a symptom of aging, he was with them. He was financing another life. Downstairs, the front door slammed shut. "Maggie?" Richard's voice drifted up, startling me so badly I dropped the heavy ledger. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. Silence stretched through the house. Then, the unmistakable sound of Richard's heavy footsteps moving toward the hallway, toward the open attic door. "Maggie?" His voice came again, but this time, the casual tone was gone. It was replaced by a sharp, rising panic. "Are you up there?" The bottom stair groaned under his weight. He was coming up. A cold, humming vibration settled behind my ribs, the kind of absolute, hyper-focused clarity that only arrives in moments of profound shock. I had less than 5 seconds before his eyes cleared the top of the stairs. I shoved the ledgers and the glossy photograph back into the heavy metal box, slamming the lid shut. I kicked it hard into the dark recess between the joists, and desperately hauled the heavy cedar chest over the loose floorboard. The broken brass lock still lay on the dust. I snatched it up, shoving it deep into the pocket of my jeans, just as Richard's head and shoulders emerged into the dim attic light. He was breathing heavily, his hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes darted around the shadowed space, landing on me. "Maggie!" He exhaled, swiping a hand across his forehead. "What was that noise? It sounded like a gunshot up here." "Just me being clumsy," I said. My voice was entirely unrecognizable to me. Smooth, even, and horrifyingly calm. I gestured to an overturned cardboard box of vintage glass ornaments, which I had deliberately tipped over with my foot a second before. A few shattered red bulbs lay scattered across the insulation. I lost my footing, scared myself half to death. Richard didn't move. He stood at the top of the stairs, scanning the perimeter of the attic. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long on the corner where the cedar chest sat. "I told you I was going to do this," he said, his tone tight, lacking its usual warmth. "It's filthy up here. You're covered in soot." "I was just looking for the girls' old baby clothes," I replied, standing up and brushing my hands on my thighs. The jagged metal of the broken lock pressed sharply against my hip through the denim. "But you're right. It's too heavy for me. I'll leave the rest to you." I walked toward him, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. I expected to see guilt. I expected to see the face of a stranger. But that was the most terrifying part. He looked exactly like my husband. He looked like the man who brought me tea when I had a migraine. The man who had cried when our youngest daughter walked down the aisle. As I passed him to descend the stairs, he reached out and gently touched my arm. "Are you okay, Mag? You're trembling." "Just the dust," I murmured, pulling away entirely too fast. "I need a shower." The water in the shower ran scalding hot, turning the bathroom into a thick cloud of steam. But I couldn't stop shaking. I sat on the porcelain floor of the tub, letting the water beat against my shoulders, trying to assemble the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. David Hayes, $2,000 a month, 30 years. That was nearly $750,000 funneled out of our shared accounts, disguised as bad investments, lean market years, and necessary budget cuts. I thought about the year I took a second job at the local library to help pay for Sarah's college tuition, because Richard said his company was freezing bonuses. He had been sending our daughter's tuition to a different state. That evening, the architecture of our home felt entirely different. The walls seemed like thin paper sets in a stage play. Every interaction was suddenly loaded with a sickening double meaning. "Dinner was fantastic, honey," Richard said, methodically wiping his mouth with a napkin as we sat across from each other in the dining room. "Did you tell them that?" I thought, staring at his mouth. "Did you buy them dinners? Did you sit at their table and smile exactly like that?" "Thank you," I said aloud, picking up my wine glass. My phone buzzed on the table. "It was our eldest daughter, Elena," I answered, forcing a bright, maternal warmth into my voice that tasted like ash in my throat. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom!" "Just checking in on the big packing operation?" Elena chirped. The background noise of her own chaotic household filtered through the speaker. "Is Dad driving you crazy yet? Has he alphabetized the spice rack?" Richard chuckled from across the table, hearing her through the receiver. "We're managing," I said, gripping the stem of my wine glass until my fingers ached. "Well, pace yourselves," Elena said softly. "I was just telling Mark today, you and Dad are my absolute goals. 38 years, and you still operate like a perfectly synchronized team. It's rare, Mom. I hope you know that." A profound, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I was the guardian of her reality now. If I shattered my world, I shattered hers too. "We love you, Elena," I managed to whisper, before ending the call and excusing myself to the kitchen under the pretense of washing the dishes. I waited until midnight. I waited until I heard the slow, rhythmic cadence of Richard's breathing through the wall of our bedroom, signaling he was deeply asleep. I slipped out of bed, taking my iPad to the dark kitchen. The glow of the screen illuminated the marble countertops as I typed the address I had memorized from the deposit slips into a public property records database. The screen loaded, bathing my face in pale blue light. 1428 Elmwood Drive. The property was a 4-bedroom colonial purchased 12 years ago. I scrolled down to the ownership history, my vision blurring at the edges. The primary owner was listed as David Hayes. But there, right beneath it, was the name of the co-signer on the deed, the guarantor of the mortgage, Richard Thomas. He hadn't just been sending them an allowance, he had bought them a home exactly like ours. I closed the browser, the glass screen cool beneath my fingertips. I didn't cry. The capacity for tears had evaporated hours ago, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. I stood up, walked quietly down the hall to the guest bedroom, and pulled a Steitantas, small overnight duffel bag from the closet. I didn't pack much, just enough for 2 days. I was done waiting for the floorboards to give way beneath me. Tomorrow morning, when Richard left for his, quote, golf Saturday, I was going to drive across the state line. I was going to knock on the door of 1428 Elmwood Drive, and I was going to look the other half of my husband's life directly in the eye. The zipper of Richard's golf bag sounded unusually loud in the quiet of the mudroom. I stood at the kitchen counter, mechanically wiping a damp sponge over the already pristine marble, watching him through the archway. "I should be back by 3, he called out, hoisting the leather strap over his shoulder. He paused, looking at me with a mild, practiced expression of husbandly concern. "You didn't sleep well last night, Maggie. You tossed and turned for hours. Why don't you leave the packing today and just rest?" Rest? The word hung in the air, heavy and absurd. "I'll take it easy," I replied, focusing entirely on a microscopic water spot near the faucet. He walked over and pressed his lips to my temple. The touch felt entirely alien, like a stranger brushing past me in a crowded room. My skin actually tightened, rejecting the familiarity, but I forced my muscles to remain perfectly still. "Love you," he murmured, before turning and walking out the door. I waited until the low rumble of his sedan faded at the end of the street. Then, I dropped the sponge. The carefully maintained facade I had worn for 48 hours shattered instantly. I grabbed the overnight bag I had hidden in the guest room closet, my car keys, and a thermos of black coffee. 10 minutes later, I was merging onto the interstate, the GPS on my dashboard projecting a sterile blue line toward a town 240 miles away. The first hour of the drive was consumed by a blinding, suffocating anger. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that the joints in my fingers throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I listened to the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt, calculating the mathematics of my stolen life. $750,000. 30 years of diverted funds. But the money, as staggering as it was, felt secondary to the theft of my reality. At 62, society tells a woman that her narrative arc is mostly complete. You are meant to be the keeper of the family archives, the curator of holiday traditions, the stable foundation upon which your children build their own lives. You are supposed to be settling into the quiet, well-earned comfort of an autumn existence. Instead, driving down Interstate 95, I felt entirely erased. Every memory I possessed now required an asterisk. Our 10th anniversary trip to Maine. Did he call them from the hotel lobby? The day Elena graduated from college. Was he calculating his next transfer to David while clapping in the bleachers? The architecture of my past had collapsed, leaving me standing in the rubble, unsure if I had ever truly been loved, or if I was merely managed. By the second hour, the anger burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, desolate clarity. I glanced at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The soft lines around my eyes, the silver woven through my dark hair. I was not a young, naive girl to be discarded or paid off. I had built that bank account just as much as Richard had. I had compromised my own career in administration to raise our daughters and support his corporate climb. I was not going to Elmwood Drive to weep or beg. I was going to demand the equity of my life. I was going to look this other family in the face, document the assets Richard had purchased for them, and then I was going to hire the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state. The landscape outside the window gradually shifted. The familiar, sprawling suburbs of our home state gave way to dense pine forests, and eventually, the winding, tree-lined roads of a quiet, affluent neighboring county. In 1 mile, take the exit. The automated voice of the GPS announced, startling me. The cheerful neutrality of the digital voice felt like a mockery of the destination. My mouth went completely dry. I reached for the thermos, the lukewarm coffee tasting bitter and metallic against my tongue. I turned onto Elmwood Drive. It was a picturesque, sickeningly perfect street. Mature oak trees formed a canopy over wide, manicured lawns. Children's bicycles were abandoned on pristine sidewalks. It was the kind of neighborhood Richard and I had dreamed of when we were young and scraping by in our first cramped apartment. I slowed the car to a crawl, my eyes scanning the brass numbers fastened to the brick mailboxes. 1420, 1424, 1428. I pulled the car over to the curb and shifted into park, but I didn't turn off the ignition. The engine idled, sending a low vibration up through my seat. The house at 1428 was a stunning, 2-story colonial painted a soft slate blue with crisp white trim. It was impeccably maintained. A late-model SUV sat in the wide driveway. A pair of hanging ferns swayed gently on the front porch. And there, kneeling in the dirt of a sprawling flower bed near the front walkway, was a man. He was wearing faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, his back to the street as he dug a small hole with a hand trowel. Even from the back, I recognized the broad shoulders and the dark, thick hair from the photograph hidden in my attic. David Hayes. The air in the car suddenly felt too thin to breathe. A heavy, rhythmic pulsing started behind my ears. This was it. The proxy of my husband's deceit. The recipient of my daughter's college funds. The center of Richard's secret universe. I turned the key, cutting the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. I opened the door and stepped out onto the asphalt. The midday sun pressed heavy and warm against my shoulders, but a cold sweat had broken out along my spine. I closed the car door, the metallic click echoing down the quiet suburban street. At the sound, the man in the garden paused. He wiped a gloved hand across his brow and slowly turned around to face the street. I braced myself, lifting my chin. preparing the cold, uncompromising opening line I had rehearsed for 200 miles. But as he stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees and turned his face fully toward the sunlight, the words evaporated from my mind entirely. My breath caught sharply in my throat, snagging on a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The pavement beneath my feet seemed to tilt dangerously. He didn't have Richard's eyes. He didn't have Richard's jawline. He had mine. The midday sun continued to beat down on the asphalt, but a sharp, icy prickle rushed across my scalp and down the back of my neck. My vision tunneled, the edges of the manicured lawn and the slate blue house blurring into meaningless color. The man, David, took a tentative step toward the edge of his property. He pulled off his canvas gardening glove, his brow furrowing in polite confusion. But as he drew closer, the distance closing between us, the geometric impossible reality of his face slammed into me. He didn't possess a single one of Richard's features. He had my mother's deeply hooded hazel eyes. He had the sharp, prominent slope of my own cheekbones. And when his lips parted in slight hesitation, I saw the exact same slight asymmetry in his smile that I saw in my own reflection every morning. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was warm, a low baritone that vibrated in the quiet air. My lips parted, but my throat had seized completely shut. The oxygen in the space between us felt thick, resistant. I tried to command my vocal cords to form the accusation I had rehearsed. "Where is my husband?" But the words disintegrated. A dry, fractured sound scraped past my teeth. "I'm looking for David Hayes." He stopped at the edge of the grass. His posture relaxed, but a sudden, profound intensity settled into his hazel eyes. He looked at me, really looked at me, studying the lines of my face, the gray at my temples, the shape of my jaw. I watched the realization move across his features like a shadow passing over a landscape. It wasn't the panic of a man caught in a financial scheme. It was a look of quiet, monumental reverence. "I'm David," he said softly. He didn't step back, he took a slow breath. "You're Margaret." The pavement beneath my feet felt as though it were turning to wet clay. "You're Margaret." "How do you know my name?" I whispered, the sound barely carrying over the distance. "I've known your name for a very long time," David said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. He gestured toward the front door. "Please, you look like you're going to fall over. Come inside." I followed him up the front steps, my legs feeling entirely hollow, disjointed from the rest of my body. The interior of the house smelled of lemon polish and old paper. It was a beautiful, lived-in space. Framed photographs lined the hallway. In my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of a smiling woman and two young children, a boy and a girl. My chest tightened painfully. I was standing in the center of a stranger's home, entirely unmoored from reality. If this wasn't Richard's hidden family, then who were they? And why was Richard financing them? David led me into a bright, sunlit kitchen and pulled out a chair at the oak dining table. "Sit, please. I'll get you some water." I sank into the chair, gripping the wooden edge so tightly my joints ached. I watched him move to the sink. The angle of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head, it was like watching an echo of my own mannerisms cast onto a different body. He set a glass of water in front of me, then sat down opposite me. He didn't push. He just waited, allowing the silence to settle between us, giving me the space to process the impossible geometry of the room. "You look like me," I finally managed to say, the statement hanging raw and vulnerable in the air. David offered a sad, knowing smile. "I do. I noticed it the first time I saw a picture of you." "A picture?" I pressed my fingertips to my temples, trying to stop the spinning in my head. Richard gave you a picture of me." "Yes." David folded his hands on the table. They were large, capable hands, dusted with dry earth from the garden. "Margaret, I always hoped you would come. Richard told me it might never happen. He said I had to respect your boundaries, that you needed the distance. But I always hoped." The rhythm in my chest stuttered, a heavy, painful thud against my ribs. "Respect my boundaries? David, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you are to my husband." David's expression faltered, the gentle certainty in his eyes shattered, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. He sat back in his chair, studying me. "You really don't know," he said, the words barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. He stood up abruptly, the wooden legs of his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. He walked out of the kitchen, disappearing down the hall. I sat frozen, the cold condensation from the water glass soaking into the sleeve of my blouse. A moment later, he returned. He was holding a small, heavy envelope made of thick cream stationery. It was aged, the edges slightly yellowed. He placed it softly on the table between us and slid it toward my hands. "Richard gave me this on my 18th birthday," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said if you ever came looking for me, I was supposed to let you read it first." I stared at the envelope. My name wasn't on it. It simply said, "To David." My fingers felt numb as I reached out and lifted the flap. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper. I recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting immediately. It was Richard's. The ink was faded, but the words were perfectly legible. "David, if you are reading this, it means you are old enough to understand the complexities of the adult world. Or it means Margaret has finally found the courage to stand on your porch. I need you to understand something about your mother before you judge her absence. She is the strongest woman I have ever met. But the world she grew up in was unforgiving. When a 16-year-old girl in her town found herself in trouble, she wasn't offered grace. She was hidden away, forced into choices she was too young to make, and told to bury her grief out of shame. Margaret never told me about you. She carried that trauma in absolute silence because she believed it made her unworthy. I found the clinic records in an old shoebox hidden in her childhood bedroom just a few weeks before our wedding. I saw the date. I saw the closed adoption papers. I saw the piece of herself she was forced to cut away. I made a vow then to protect her from that pain. I couldn't undo the past, but I could make sure you were safe. I tracked your adoptive family down. When your adoptive father passed away and things got difficult financially, I stepped in. I made sure your tuition was paid. I made sure this house was secure. I wanted to build a safety net for you, so that wherever Margaret was, even if she never knew, she never had to worry about the son she had to leave behind. Do not be angry with her for not knowing about my support. I kept it from her to carry the weight she couldn't bear. I bought this silence because I loved her. Richard?" The paper slipped from my grasp, fluttering to the oak table like a dead leaf. The air rushed out of my lungs entirely. The room tilted, the sunlight streaming through the windows suddenly blindingly harsh. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't a secret family. It was my secret. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. The cold, sterile smell of the clinic in 1980. The agonizing, hollow ache in my arms when the nurse walked away with the blanket. The suffocating terror of returning to my parents' house. Forced to smile. Forced to pretend that a fundamental piece of my soul hadn't been quietly amputated. I had buried it so deep, encased it in so much shame, that I had convinced myself I didn't deserve to grieve. I looked up at David, my son, the child I had mourned in the dark for 46 years, sitting alive and breathing in front of me. But as the profound, world-altering joy of his existence washed over me, a darker, colder realization began to bleed into the edges of my mind. I looked back down at the date penned at the top corner of Richard's letter. October 12th, 1988. 38 years. For 38 years, every time I fell into a quiet, inexplicable depression in late October, he knew why. Every time I held our daughters extra tight, terrified of the fragility of motherhood, he knew why. He had sat across from me at thousands of dinners, watched me age, watched me carry a phantom grief that I thought I was bearing entirely alone. He didn't just hide my son from me. He had quietly, methodically appointed himself the sole manager of my trauma. He had decided I was too fragile for my own reality. The foundation of my marriage hadn't been destroyed by another woman. It had been suffocated by a decades-long paternalistic lie disguised as love. I stood up from the table. My knees didn't shake. The agonizing confusion was gone, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline focus. "Margaret?" David asked, standing up quickly, alarmed by the sudden shift in my posture. I looked at the beautiful man standing in the kitchen. "My flesh. My blood. I need to go home, David," I whispered, the coldness of my own voice echoing in my ears. "I need to go home and speak to my husband." The 240 miles back to our house felt entirely different from the drive there. The frantic, burning adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, terrifying stillness. I didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic thrum of the tires against the highway, keeping time with the relentless turning of my own thoughts. I thought about the word protection. For decades, I had believed the defining characteristic of our marriage was safety. Richard was the sturdy walls holding up our roof. I was the warmth radiating inside it. But as the miles rolled by, the definition of that safety warped and twisted. When you build a structure around a person to shield them from the wind, you are also deciding they aren't strong enough to weather the storm. You are blocking their view of the horizon. You are deciding, without their permission, what kind of air they are allowed to breathe. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the late afternoon sun had stretched long, bruised purple shadows across the lawn. The house looked exactly as it had when I left, imposing, familiar, and packed with 38 years of carefully curated history. I turned the key in the front door. The heavy oak swung open, revealing the hallway lined with half-filled cardboard boxes. "Maggie, is that you?" Richard's voice came from the dining room. I heard the sharp, tearing sound of packing tape being pulled from a dispenser. I walked slowly down the hall, dropping my keys onto the entryway table. The metallic clatter seemed to echo endlessly. When I stepped into the dining room, Richard was leaning over a box of fine china, carefully wrapping a teacup in bubble wrap. He wore his favorite faded college sweatshirt, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked up and offered a warm, easy smile. "You were gone a long time. Did you end up going to that antique mall out on Route 9? I got the study completely boxed up while you were—" He stopped. The smile faltered, sliding off his face as he truly looked at me. He must have seen the glacial, absolute shift in my posture. The familiar, accommodating wife he had kissed goodbye that morning was gone. "Margaret?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. He set the teacup down on the table. "What's wrong? You look incredibly pale. Did something happen with Elena or Sarah?" I didn't answer right away. I walked over to the dining table, stopping opposite him. I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the heavy cream envelope I had asked David to let me take. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the polished mahogany surface, right next to the packing tape. Richard's eyes tracked the movement. He looked down at the envelope. I watched the exact second the architecture of his reality collapsed. It wasn't a dramatic gasp or a sudden staggering step backward. It was a slow, microscopic deflation. The color drained from his face, starting at his cheeks and leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His shoulders, usually pulled back with quiet confidence, rounded forward, collapsing under the invisible weight he had carried for nearly 40 years. He didn't try to feign ignorance. He didn't ask what it was. He just stared at his own faded handwriting. "I drove to Elmwood Drive," I said. My voice was eerily level, devoid of the screaming anger I thought I would feel. It sounded like the voice of a stranger narrating a documentary. "I met him, Richard. I sat at his kitchen table. And I read the letter you wrote." Richard closed his eyes. A long, ragged exhale shuddered past his lips. He pressed his palms flat against the table, leaning his weight onto his wrists as if the floor were no longer stable. "Maggie," he started, the words scraping against his throat. "Do not manage me right now." I cut in, the sharpness of my tone slicing through the quiet room. "Do not soften your voice. Do not try to gentle the blow. We are 40 years past the point of gentle." He opened his eyes, and for the first time in our entire marriage, I saw him completely stripped of his armor. The capable, problem-solving patriarch was gone. In his place was a terrified man. "I was trying to save you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't see yourself back then, Margaret. You were 24 when we met. But you carried this crushing shadow. When I found those clinic records, everything made sense. The night terrors. The way you would completely shut down in late October. You were drowning in it, and you decided I didn't know how to swim," I said, the cold truth of it settling heavily in my chest. "You were so fragile," he pleaded, taking a step around the table toward me. I held up a hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "I saw the closed adoption paperwork. I saw how your parents had treated you. If I had brought it up, if I had forced you to face it, I thought it would break you. I thought you would run. So you paid for his life in secret," I said, recounting the facts like a prosecutor laying out evidence. "You diverted our money, you forged a separate reality, and you sat across from me at the dinner table while I grieved a child I thought was lost to the world forever. You watched me cry, Richard. You held me while I mourned a phantom, knowing all along exactly where he was and what he looked like. I made sure he had a good life." Richard's voice rose, desperation bleeding into his defense. His adoptive father died, Maggie. They had nothing. If I hadn't stepped in, he wouldn't have gone to college. He wouldn't have that house. I did it for you. Every check I wrote because I loved you enough to carry the burden so you didn't have to. You didn't carry my burden, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, resonant whisper. You stole my grief. You stole my agency. You took the most agonizing, defining experience of my life, and you locked it in an attic lockbox like it was just another piece of administrative paperwork for you to manage. Tears finally welled in Richard's eyes, spilling over his lower lashes and tracking into the deep lines around his mouth. I didn't want you to feel the shame anymore. The shame wasn't yours to take. I pressed my hand against my sternum, a sudden, fierce heat radiating through my ribs. It was my pain, Richard. It was my healing to do. By hiding him from me, you didn't protect me from the past. You froze me in it. You treated me like a broken child, not a partner. Silence descended on the dining room, heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of cardboard dust and old secrets. Richard looked down at his trembling hands, the realization of what his protection had cost me, finally sinking into his bones. He has my eyes, Richard, I said softly, the image of David standing in the sunlight flashing in my mind. He has my laugh. He was 2 hours away for 30 years, and you decided I wasn't allowed to know him. Richard looked up, his face a portrait of absolute devastation. Maggie, please, what do we do now? The house is half packed. Our whole life. He gestured helplessly at the boxes surrounding us. Can you ever forgive me? I looked around the room. At the taped-up boxes containing the remnants of a marriage built on a foundational lie. I looked back at the man who had loved me enough to lie to me for 4 decades. I don't know, I said honestly, the words tasting like copper. I picked up my car keys from the table, the metal cold against my palm. But tomorrow morning, I am driving back to Elmwood Drive. I am going to have coffee with my son. And you are not coming with me. I turned my back on him and walked toward the stairs. But as my hand grasped the wooden banister, Richard's voice called out from the dining room, halting me on the first step. Margaret, he said, his tone entirely shifted. The desperation was gone, replaced by a dark, heavy hesitation that made the hair on my arms stand up. There's something else. Something about David's adoptive family you need to know before you go back. My hand froze on the polished wood of the banister. The silence in the hallway stretched tight, like a wire pulled to the absolute point of snapping. I didn't turn around. I simply let my hand drop to my side, the weight of the car keys pulling my shoulder down. What else could there possibly be, Richard? I heard his footsteps, slow and heavy, moving from the dining room into the archway. He didn't come too close, respecting the sudden, vast, and terrifying chasm that had opened between us. The letter I left for him on his 18th birthday. That wasn't the first time we met, Richard said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual comforting resonance. When David's adoptive father passed away, David was only 8. His mother, Eleanor, she was completely lost. They were going to lose the house, Maggie. I couldn't just wire money from afar. It raised too many legal questions. I had to set up a trust. I had to meet with her. A cold, metallic pressure began to expand behind my sternum, pushing against my ribs until it felt impossible to draw a full breath. I slowly turned to face him. You met his adoptive mother, I stated, the words tasting like chalk. I had to explain why a stranger was paying off her mortgage, Richard pleaded, his hands turning outward in a gesture of absolute surrender. I told her I was an old friend of his biological father, that I had made a promise to look after the boy if anything ever went wrong. He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floorboards. Eleanor was so grateful, and David, he was this quiet, grieving little kid. He needed a stable male figure. The floor beneath me seemed to liquefy. The puzzle pieces of the last 30 years rapidly rearranged themselves, forming a picture so devastating it momentarily blinded me. You didn't just send checks, I whispered, the horrifying realization crawling up my throat. You were in his life. Richard nodded, a single, agonizing movement. He calls me his godfather, Maggie. I was there when he graduated high school. I helped him negotiate the price on his first car. I attended his wedding. I sat in the back pew. The illusion of Richard the Protector entirely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, breathtaking selfishness. You went to his wedding, I repeated. The physical sensation was indescribable. It wasn't heartbreak, it was an amputation. My lungs burned. Every time you told me you were at a regional sales conference in October, you were buying him birthday presents. You were watching him blow out candles. I was trying to give him the life you would have wanted for him." Richard stepped forward, his voice cracking with a desperate, agonizing defense. "No!" The word tore from my throat, raw and deafening in the quiet house. I pointed a trembling finger at him. "You did not do that for me! You did it for yourself! You siphoned off the joy of raising my son. You hoarded all the milestones, the birthdays, the graduations, and you left me with nothing but the grief. You gotta be the benevolent savior, while I spent 40 years believing my child was lost to the wind." Richard physically recoiled, covering his face with his hands. A Ken's low, ragged sob tore through his chest. It was a terrible sound, the sound of a man watching the foundational lie of his entire adult life collapse around him. But for the first time in 38 years, I felt no instinct to comfort him. The empathy I had always freely given him felt entirely foreign to me now. I turned my back on him and walked up the stairs. I bypassed the guest room and went straight to our master bedroom. I didn't take the small overnight duffel this time. I pulled my large, hard-shell suitcase from the top of the closet. I moved methodically, mechanically, emptying my dresser drawers. Sweaters, slacks, toiletries. I was not packing for a night. I was dismantling my presence in this house. When I dragged the heavy suitcase down the stairs 20 minutes later, Richard was sitting on the bottom step, his head in his hands. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face aged a decade in the span of an hour. "Maggie, please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "Where are you going? You can't just leave. The house. The closing is in 3 weeks." "Sell it," I said, gripping the handle of my suitcase. "Or don't. Call a lawyer. Tell the girls whatever you want. I don't care about the house anymore, Richard." I walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking firmly shut behind me, severing the life I had known. I drove for an hour before pulling into a sterile, brightly lit chain hotel right off the interstate. Once inside the room, sitting on the edge of the stiff mattress, the adrenaline finally crashed. But instead of crying, I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself in the harsh fluorescent mirror. Society tells women my age that our defining moments are behind us. We are supposed to fade quietly, into the background, maintaining the peace, preserving the family legacy. But looking at the silver in my hair and the sharp, defiant lines of my jaw, I realized that true empowerment doesn't always look like a triumph. Sometimes it looks like a demolition. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was the sole author of my own reality. I barely slept. I watched the digital clock on the nightstand slowly cycle through the early morning hours, waiting for the sun to rise. At 8 a.m., I was back on the road. By 9:30 a.m., I was pulling back onto Elmwood Drive. The slate blue house looked identical to the day before, perfectly serene in the morning light. I parked the car, my pulse steadying into a slow, deliberate rhythm. I walked up the paved path, bypassed the flower beds where I had first seen David, and stepped onto the porch. I raised my hand and knocked firmly on the wooden door. I expected David's warm, hazel eyes to meet me. I had prepared what I was going to say to my son, a carefully constructed bridge to cross the 40 years we had lost. I heard footsteps approaching from inside. The deadbolt clicked open. But as the door swung inward, it wasn't David standing in the foyer. It was an older woman, perhaps in her late 70s, with elegant, silver hair and piercing blue eyes. She wore a soft cardigan, a damp dish towel clutched in her hands. She looked at me, her gaze traveling over my face, taking in the slope of my cheekbones and the shape of my jaw. The polite inquiry faded from her expression, instantly replaced by a look of profound, deeply rooted recognition. The towel slipped from her grasp, pooling on the hardwood floor. "Oh, dear God," she whispered, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "You're her. You're the girl from the clinic." The air in the foyer suddenly smelled of lavender and old, forgotten fears. I stood paralyzed as the woman, Eleanor, stared at me with a gaze so sharp it felt like she was looking through 46 years of scar tissue. "I'm Margaret," I said, my voice barely a thread. Eleanor didn't move for a long moment. Then she stepped back, gesturing into a sun-drenched living room filled with the quiet clutter of a life well lived. "I know who you are. I've seen your face in every line of David since he was a toddler. And I've seen your face in the way Richard looked at the horizon every time he visited." I followed her. my legs feeling heavy. We sat in two wingback chairs facing a fireplace that wasn't lit. Richard told me he was a friend of the biological father, I said, my voice gaining a jagged edge of coldness. He told me he sat in the back of David's wedding. He told me he was a godfather. Eleanor's expression softened into something that looked like pity, and it was the most insulting thing I had ever seen. He was more than that, Margaret. He was the man who made sure David never felt the sting of being unwanted. But he was also a man haunted by a ghost he refused to name. He didn't have to name the ghost, I snapped. He was living with her. He told me you didn't want to know, Eleanor said softly, her blue eyes searching mine. He told me the memory of the clinic was so traumatic that if David ever reached out, it would destroy your mind. He said he was a buffer, a shield. I leaned forward, my fingers digging into the fabric of the chair. A shield? Eleanor. He was a cage. He decided for me that I was too weak to be a mother. He decided for you that you had to lie to your son about where the money was coming from. He managed us both like assets in a portfolio. We sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't the silence of enemies, but the silence of two women who had been playing parts in a play written by a man who thought he knew better than both of us. David is at the park with the kids, Eleanor finally said. He'll be back in an hour. He didn't sleep last night. He kept saying, "She has my eyes. Why didn't she want me?" My heart didn't skip a beat. It felt like it was being squeezed by a giant invisible hand. The physical ache was so profound, I had to press my palm against my chest. I wanted him every single second of every single day for 40 years. I whispered. I just didn't think I was allowed to say it out loud. The resolution of a 38-year lie doesn't happen in a single, cinematic explosion. It happens in the quiet, grueling work of the months that follow. I didn't go back to Richard. Not really. The house was sold 3 weeks later. I didn't help with the final packing. I hired a crew to take my things, the things that were actually mine, and move them into a small, bright apartment in the town where David lived. I didn't ask for Richard's permission. I didn't wait for his management. We met one final time at the closing of the sale. The law office was cold and smelled of toner and stale coffee. Richard looked smaller than I remembered. The vibrant, capable man who had navigated our lives was gone, replaced by someone who looked perpetually confused by the silence of his own home. He pushed a stack of papers toward me. "The proceeds from the sale," he said, his voice thin. "I've instructed the bank to split it 60-40. In your favor. I don't want a tip, Richard," I said, signing my name with a steady hand. "I want the truth. From now on, that's the only currency I accept." He looked at me, his eyes brimming with a desperate, lingering need to be the hero. "I loved you, Maggie. Everything I did. I did it so you wouldn't have to suffer. And that was your greatest sin," I replied, sliding the pen back to him. "You thought suffering was something you could steal from me. But suffering is how we grow. By saving me from my past, you robbed me of my future. I forgave the boy who left the clinic. I'm not sure I'll ever forgive the man who kept me from the man that boy became." 6 months later, I am standing in a garden, not the one at the colonial house with the wraparound porch, but a small, messy patch of dirt behind my apartment. David is kneeling next to me, showing me how to prune the hydrangeas. "You're cutting too close to the bud, Mom," he says, his voice full of a gentle, easy humor that I am still learning to trust. "Charch, Mom." The word still feels like a miracle every time it vibrates in the air. We are not fixed. There are still moments of profound awkwardness, moments where the 40-year gap between us feels like a physical wall. There are questions he asks that I don't know how to answer, and there are stories he tells about his childhood, about Godfather Richard taking him to ball games, that make my blood run cold with a fresh wave of resentment. "But we are here," Richard calls sometimes. I answer, occasionally. We talk about the daughters, who are still reeling from the revelation, trying to navigate their own relationships with a father they no longer fully recognize. He is living in a small condo near the coast, spending his retirement in the very quiet he once tried to protect me from. I am 63 years old. My life didn't end when The Secret came out. It began. I look at David, at the way the sun catches the hazel in his eyes, my eyes. I realize that the architecture of silence is finally gone. The walls are down, the floorboards are pulled up, and for the first time in my life, I can see the sky. It's a messy, unpredictable, and sometimes stormy sky. but it's mine, and I am finally strong enough to stand in the rain.